next speaker is the choir director of the Holy Virgin Cathedral. He's been choir director for over 45 years. He grew up in Burlingame. His brother is, one brother is a priest, and another brother is head of the Russian ecclesiastical mission. And Vladimir knew St. John personally. He was a young boy and a man. Later a teen, and he sometimes accompanied St. John to the hospital. He served with him, and in general he's quite observant, and he's quite amazing because he remembers a lot of details from the past. And if you want to know what life was like at the cathedral before in the Russian community, he has a knack for remember these things and preserving them and treasuring those things. It's very important to treasure the past, and we built on the past. We built for the future. Without a foundation, you cannot really build a house. And I've said before that the Orthodox Church is always ancient, and it's always new. So it has the tradition, the history, and it's always fresh, dynamic, and young. We welcome Vladimir Krassovsky.
I'm honored to be here. And as I was putting this talk together, I began to realize how important it was to convey things about our St. John. I was blessed to be close to him. And as I was writing this talk, when I would write something, go, oh, that happened too. And it was an enduring experience remembering everything, but this forced me to do it. So here it goes. It's going to be in short little chapters because each little chapter is an incident which I remembered and will describe. In between, we're going to try and race through some slides. They're not in any particular order. I want to thank Helen Novak here. Where's Helen Novak?
I haven't seen her.
The lady's an angel. She helps me every time with all this technical stuff. And
Speaking of technical stuff, your foot's caught on the wire.
my foot's caught on the wire?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's speaking of technical stuff. Okay, here we go. Family connection. My family has been connected with Vladika John since Shanghai, China. My mother attended the girls' school, which was run by the Russian League of Women. The school had a house church in the name of Sofia, Vera, Nadezhda, and Lyubov. St. John visited the school several times a year. Since it was an all-girls school, get this, the young girls were allowed to serve in the altar, up to a certain age. When St. John came to serve in the school church on their feast day, my mother and her friends were serving in the altar. They didn't wear sticharians, they wore their school uniforms. My mother remembers when they tried to vest Vladika in the middle of the church. Everything went fine until they got to the large amaphorion. And they made multiple attempts to put it on correctly. St. John didn't bat an eye. He stood there with a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye. As he waited for my mother and her friend to finally figure it out. My mother and her friends regularly attended the cathedral on Sundays and feast days. To Babao, to Bangkok. My father and mother met in Shanghai where my father proposed marriage to my mother. When the Communist Revolution erupted in China in 1949, the Russians were forced to flee again. The Russians had no place to go. They were stateless. No one would accept them. The Philippine government helped out by allowing Russian refugees to set up a refugee camp on a small island of Tubabao. My mother and her family evacuated the refugee camp to the refugee camp, which housed approximately 6,000 Russian refugees. There was a cathedral established in the Quantum Hut. 4 other churches were set up in tents in various regions on the island. My parents were married in the Cathedral and immediately after departed for Bangkok, Thailand, where my father had a job waiting for him. I was born a year later. There were no Orthodox churches or an Orthodox priest in Thailand. Now, by the way, there's St. Nicholas Cathedral and 4 other Orthodox churches in Bangkok. My parents were very concerned about baptizing me, so my father wrote Vladika, who happened to be in New York. Vladika answered with a letter and a small silver cross attached to it. In other words, he answered my father basically immediately. This was what the letter said. November 28, 1950, old style. Saint Hieromartyr Stefan, Saint Irinar, dear Vadim Vladimirovich, my father, I congratulate you and Larissa with the birth of your son and invoke God's blessings on you and the newborn child. It's regretful that you have no opportunity to invite a priest for baptism. Baptism must be performed by a person of the Orthodox faith, but in no way in a non-Orthodox church. The first variation would, of course, be better. But if it is uncertain of a priest coming, then it is dangerous to leave an infant unbaptized for a long period of time. In the event of even possible danger of a child not being baptized, the sacrament may be administered by any Orthodox Christian, male or female. In this type of circumstance, it is imperative that the sacrament too be performed correctly, specifically submerging the child 3 times and saying the words. And I'll show you the letter in a second. Vladika wrote it in different ink colors. The servant of God, name, is baptized in the name of the Father, submerge, amen. And the Son, submerge, amen. And the Holy Spirit, submerge, amen. Now and ever, and unto the ages of ages, amen. If your arrival to America or any other place where there is an Orthodox church may be delayed for a lengthy period of time, then you can ask a pious Orthodox person if there are any at your location, or you yourselves can perform the baptism. In this case, at a later date, a priest must also administer the sacrament of chrismation. It is imperative that the words of the sacrament of baptism be pronounced exactly. Await future news from you. May God bless you and keep you. Yours, John, Archbishop of Shanghai. I was baptized on Pascha 1951 by my father. 2 years later, we moved to Hong Kong, where I was chrismated, and my 2 younger brothers were baptized by Father Elias Vien, who was a priest here in our cathedral for many years and died at the age of 110. 1956, to America. We immigrated to the United States in 1956. In 1956, Vladika just happened to come from Brussels to visit his St. Tikhon's orphanage here in San Francisco. He contacted my parents and asked them to bring me to San Francisco as he wanted to meet me and see my parents. My parents related to me that when we all arrived at St. Tikhon's, and after a warm conversation with my parents, Vladika escorted me into the altar and spent quite a long period of time there with me. Unfortunately, since I was only 6 years old, I didn't remember any of the conversation at all. My parents had no idea what was discussed with me either. All they could say was that Vladika spent a long time in the altar with me. At that time, Vladika was Archbishop of Western Europe. In the late 50s and early 60s, our new cathedral was being built. As usual, when churches are being built, there's turmoil. There were 2 opposing sides fighting each other, going to court, feuding in the media. Most of the people in San Francisco Bay Area were from China, the China immigration. The faction of parishioners who wanted the cathedral to be built were from China and knew Vladika John very well. It was primarily this faction, my father included, that began petitioning the Synod of Bishops, asking that they send Vladika John to be the ruling Archbishop of Western American diocese. I remember as a boy that my father would be on the phone in the evenings after work, sending telegram after telegram with 3 or 4 signatures attached to each. After receiving scores of these types of telegrams, the Synod appointed Vladika John to the Western American diocese. During Vladika's 3 years of tenure here, I had the blessing and opportunity to see him and be with him much more often. Let's go through some slides. This is a typical, that's the letter that Vladika wrote that's Vladika typical during the service. I remember that Amaphorian, it had plastic interfacing, it was stiff as a rock. Next, that's the letter that Vladika wrote my parents, and you see the little baptismal cross attached to it in the corner, and you see that he used different color ink on the right for the actual words of the sacrament. Go on. Next. These are Vladika's parents, Boris and Glafira. That's Metropolitan Antony Hrapovitsky, founder of the Church abroad, and was Vladika John's mentor. This is Milkova, Serbian monastery, where St. John, he was there, and in the middle on the bottom, right below Metropolitan Antony, is our Vladika Antoni as a novice.
Vladika Jan is in that picture.
Yeah, Vladika Jan is to the right.
And that's Archbishop Anthony.
Yeah, that's our Vladika Antoni, Archbishop Anthony.
That's Archbishop Tikhon.
Tikhon of San Francisco as well. Is that Otец Arsenii on the right?
This one?
Yeah.
Archimandrit Arsenii?
Yeah.
No.
No. Starec Ambrosi.
There might be Otец Feodosy, the cell attendant of.
Oh, that's who it was, Feodosy.
This is the young elder. There's a book in English, the young elder.
Немноголетний старец, yeah.
See Archimandrit Ambrosi.
Ambrosi. Okay, next. That's Vladika Jan with Serbian students. As a hieromonk, it looks like, judging by his cross. One. Next. These are the Bartoshevich brothers. One is the future Bishop Leonti, and the other the future Archbishop Anthony of Geneva. Next. This is Vladika coming out of the Burlingame Church after the commencement exercises in Russian school. At that particular meeting, a group of parents revolted against Vladika and everybody. They wanted to change to Soviet textbooks from our Russian school textbooks, and Vladika was very, very upset. This picture was taken about 2 weeks before he passed. Next. That's me, and that's Father Alexander behind him. That's my little brother. Okay. This is also taken a couple of weeks before. This is the commencement in San Francisco Russian School. You'll see the Bogatsky brothers there. That's Father Spiridon in the front. He was subdeacon to Metropolitan Antony. Vladika John in the middle, and Father Afanasy, the founder of the Russian school, and Father John Shachnev. Next. This is Vladika in Shanghai. Next. This is Vladika in St. Nicholas Memorial Church in Shanghai. This is Vladika with a vicar bishop, Juvenali of Tsitsikhar, also in Shanghai. This is the Our Lady of Kazan icon, which is in our cathedral. She was painted by a Chinese iconographer, and she renewed herself. This is a miraculous icon.
That's about 15, 20 pictures.
Okay, all right, we go? Yeah. Next, Russian school. I grew up in Burlingame and was very active in the parish of All Russian Saints. My father was the parish council president for almost 20 years. There, our entire family, myself and my 3 brothers, were active in the parish as well. We were altar boys, members of the Russian Scout group, and we all studied in the parish Russian school. Vladika visited our school 2 or 3 times a year. and would sit in on classes. It was awful. The worst and most nerve-wracking time was when he came to listen to our religion exams, Zakon Boży, oral exams at the end of the school year. The first thing he would ask each student, how do you believe? In Russian, Kako верующий. And we had to recite the creed without a single mistake. And then he would ask, who is your saint? When is he or she celebrated? Tell me the life of your saint. Vladika was insistent that everyone know and befriend their patron saints. This was a requirement of every single student. Everyone was to know their patron saint. There was no Xerox at the time, so Father Nicholas, our priest, wrote everything out by hand. The life of each saint, he must have spent weeks doing it. St. John taught everyone that one's name's day is much more important than one's birthday, and that each one of us should have Holy Communion on the day of or on the nearest Sunday to our saint's day. I remember one year Vladika dozed off and fell asleep during my examination. Vladika falling asleep was nothing new to all of those that were close to him. It was a well-known fact that after his monastic tonsure, he never slept in a bed, but slept in an armchair. Who here has been to St. Tikhon's home? Just about everybody. If you haven't, go. Check out Vladika's cell. It's, I can't even describe the size of it. It's 10 by 10. And you'll see where he lived and toiled. Well, when I saw Vladika fell asleep, my answer to his question became less focused than it should have been. All of a sudden, I have to show you this. Excuse me, Vladika, I'm going to use your posuk. You have to see this. Vladika was slouched in his chair. He had the posuk on his left shoulder. And all of a sudden, as I'm answering, I see this posuk go up like this. It goes up like this, it goes up like this. And he put it on the table. And he looked at me square in the eye. He blinked, aimed, and let it fall on my head. I did not try and dodge it. He said, now answer the question properly. Liturgical moments in Burlingame. Vladika would come to our parish several times a year. I was still studying in the Russian school, and Father Nicholas was very diligent about teaching his altar boys to read in Slavonic. I was told to master the reading of the third hour, and my classmate was told to master the reading of the sixth hour, because we were to read the hours when Vladika would come to serve liturgy. Well, the day arrived. The church was full. The choir was at its best, and we greeted Vladika with bread and salt, joy and smiles. After Vladika was vested in the middle of the church, it was my time to read the third hour. The opening prayers went by quite well. But when I started to read the Psalms, I became very nervous and began to make mistakes. It was very typical of Vladika to make a specific sound when a mistake was made or something wasn't right, and that was... This type of signal is called altar language, altarny yazyk. With each mistake, I became more nervous. All of a sudden, Vladika came off his cathedra, walked over to me, and stood to the left of me, put his hand on my shoulder, thereby calming me down, and he stood there correcting my mistakes until the end of the third hour. Then he went back to his cathedra. When Vladika walked over to me, I thought he would be angry, but he wasn't. He was very serious, loving, and patient. After the reading the third hour, I disappeared into the altar. I don't even remember how the sixth hour went. Another incident in Burlingame was during the feast day of Russian saints, our patronal feast. The service was very festive. The choir sang very well. Multitude of people, clergy, and we had a procession around the church after liturgy. I was designated to carry the holy water. So I was next to Vladimir the whole time around the church. Vladimir was in a very happy mood. He had a smile on his face, and each time he raised the brush to bless the people with the holy water, he would slap it across my face. He'd do this and he'd just slap it across my face, and he'd look and he'd grin at me. I was drenched, and Vladimir would look at me with a huge smile and a twinkle in his eye. I remember as a boy that all of our processions were joyous events where everyone was exuberant, happy, and uplifted. I was not the only altar boy that Vladimir interacted in this matter. He loved his altar servers and frequently joked with them only after liturgy and services, never during the services. Perhaps the most serious occurrence with Vladimir was during the Divine Liturgy. I don't remember which one. When we were growing up in the altar in the Burlingame Church, each one of the altar boys had a little white book. It was an OCA publication. A little white book with the text of the liturgy in Slavonic on one side and English on the other. There were no priest's secret prayers in the book at all, except for the exception of the Holy Eucharist. The text of the prayer of the third hour, as well as the sacred words of the actual consecration of the gifts, were written in red. That moment of the liturgy had approached. When Vladimir raised his hands in prayer and began reciting the prayer of the third hour, I, in a subdued voice, also was reciting the same words, reading from my little white book. Vladimir stopped, sternly looked at me, and put his finger to his mouth, indicating for me to be quiet. I, being a naive teenager, proceeded to read the same prayer the second time with a quieter voice. Vladimir again looked at me and made the same gesture. Vladimir raised his arms for the third time, reciting the same prayer, and I, in even a quieter voice, recited the words again. Stupid me, right? Vladimir went like this, thereby telling me, be silent. After the liturgy, after taking his vestments off, just before leaving the altar, he pulled me aside. Again, he put his arm on my shoulder and said, do you know why I told you to be quiet? I said, no. He then proceeded to explain to me that these particular words are sacred words of the Eucharist. When the officiate, predstojatel, calls upon the Holy Spirit to come down and consecrate the holy gifts. There is only one person responsible for the execution of this sacrament, and that is the senior clergyman, and no one else. Everyone else must remain silent. Again, I felt no anger from him at all. Vladimir was like a loving father, explaining to his spiritual son the reality and sanctity of the moment. And that goes for all other sacraments as well. Vladimir was very, very conscious about the fact that you couldn't divide the actual sacrament among different priests or clergymen. The senior clergyman is responsible, and he's the only one. I've seen weddings where the moment of the sacrament, O Lord our God, crown them with glory and honor, is said thrice by the officiating priest. I've seen that divided among priests. And Vladimir would not have allowed that because that dilutes the responsibility. Anyway, let's go through some more slides. That's Vladimir in front of the Shanghai Cathedral. It's Father Elias Vien. In the back, there's Father Konstantin Zaitsev. Next, Father Filareta Strahansky on the right. This is Vladimir coming to San Francisco, getting off the boat. Wow. Go on next. That's the cathedral on Tubabao in the island. It was a hut and converted into the quote-unquote cathedral. My parents were married in that. Next. That's the service inside. These are the organizers of the immigration. To the left is Grigory Kirillовich Bologov. He was one of the main members of the immigration refugee organization. Next. And this is, again, Bologov. He's buried at our Serbian cemetery. And this is on Tubabao. This is Vladika and Tubabao on the island. Came to visit his flock. Tubabao. Next. Tubabao. Next. These are European hierarchs. Archbishop Alexander on the left, Archbishop John, and Archbishop Philafe. Vladika Alexander was of Germany, I believe. Germany. Vladika Jan was of Western Europe, and Vladika Philafe was vicar bishop. Da. Next. That's Vladika Jan in his vestments. Vladika Jan, I believe it's Lesna, or in London, one of the two monasteries. What? Lesna? He's in Lesna, okay. Next. It's Vladika Jan again. Vladika Jan at a funeral at the Lesna Monastery in France. Vladika Jan at the St. Job Monastery in München. Again, Vladika Jan serving.
It's about 20.
Okay. With Vladika at Christmas time, this took place in 1963 or 1964 when I was 13 or 14 years old. I was a senior acolyte in the Church of All Saints of Russia in Burlingame, and because of my duties there, I rarely was able to attend services in San Francisco. But my parents allowed me to serve Vladika John at the old cathedral on Christmas. I remember how regally the church was decorated with huge firs, and what an honor it was for us to attend those services with Vladika. The next day, after celebrations in St. Tikhon's of Zadonsk orphanage, where Vladika lived, I had the opportunity to go with him and visit the sick in 5 hospitals. There were 4 of us, Vladika, the driver, Paul Lukianov, and now Archbishop Peter of Chicago, and myself. Paul and I loaded the car up with several dozen small presents, and we drove off. On the way, Vladika, out of his typical little velvet pouch, took out a tattered horologian. Horologian is a Czesoslov, but it was no bigger than this. It was tiny. It was a pre-revolutionary publication, and the print was so tiny, he would hand it back to us and say, start reading the Psalms, which Paul and I took turns doing. I tell you, my eyes wouldn't be able to do that now, even with a magnifying glass. Since Vladika often visited the sick, the hospital personnel knew him very well. In every hospital, Vladika knew precisely where to go to get a list of Orthodox patients. In one of the hospitals, Vladika walked into the office, went to the desk, opened a drawer himself, and took out a list already prepared for him. That was really some authorized personnel only. Drawer, walked in, opened the drawer in the desk, took out a list. This was amazing. Words cannot describe the faces of the sick people when they saw Vladika. In every room we entered, we sang the Troparion and the Kontakion to the Feast of Nativity. Vladika John consoled every patient and gave them each a present. Often people of other faiths would call Vladika over to them as he passed by their rooms, and Vladika would go and bless them as well. Even a Russian Jewish lady kissed Vladika's hands with tears in her eyes after receiving a present from him. All day, Vladika was on 7th heaven. He loved to visit the sick. Now, this is testimony of my brother. This is another tie that our family has with Vladika. When I was Father Alexander in Santa Rosa, when I was 10 years old, I became seriously ill with mononucleosis. My temperature rose to 106, and I felt extremely weak. More than a week had passed without any change. The doctors tried everything to cure me, but finally told my mother that we just need to hope that the illness would pass off itself. I later learned that this illness frequently lasts several weeks and in extreme cases, even result in death. My father decided to call New York, where Vladimir John was partaking in a meeting of the Synod of Bishops, and tell him of my condition. Vladimir calmly assured my father that he would soon recover, not to worry, but to trust in God's mercy. The next morning, my temperature had dropped to 100, and I remember feeling much better. I even got out of bed. When the doctors heard of this, they had a hard time believing how quickly my condition had improved. They cautioned my parents that I would still have to spend a long time in bed recuperating before I regained enough strength to go to school. Before the week was over, however, I had completely recovered and returned to school. It turned out that after the conversation with my father, Vladimir John had gone to the Synod Cathedral and served the Maleben for my health. Knowing that nothing in life happens by chance, I attribute my quick recovery to the prayers of Holy St. John. A serious asthma attack averted. It's my wife. This happened in 1965. I was 8 years old. From the age of 2, I suffered from asthma, and I had serious attacks rather frequently. One evening, our family were guests at a names day party, and I began to have a bad attack. Because of it, my parents decided to leave early and take me home. The hostess, whose name's day it was, persuaded them to stay a bit longer since Vladimir John was expected. Within a matter of minutes, Vladimir John arrived and served a short Maleben in honor of the hostess's name's day. Directly after the Maleben, my parents took me to Vladimir and told him about my condition. Vladimir blessed us and stroked me on the head. Never mind. Не волнуйся. Natashenka, all will be well. We went home immediately. My parents expected that I would break into a sweat and that I wouldn't sleep all night, as often was the case during such attacks. But this did not happen. The asthma attack subsided, and I slept peacefully until morning. Dance parties. Once or twice a year, Vladimir would organize, with the help of St. Tikhon's parishioners, a dance party for the youth. He was a firm believer that the youth enjoyed themselves, socialized not only outside the church, but on the grounds of the church as well. These parties occurred in the lower hall of St. Tikhon's Church. A table would be set up with finger food, snacks, and sodas. There would be a phonograph in those days. You know what that is? It's a record player, right? And the kids would bring their own records, 33 RPMs as well as 45s. We also knew that we had to bring classical music as well, such as waltzes and polkas. There were usually about 30, 40 kids in attendance, and I was about the only one that was from out of town. I was friends with a lot of them because all our parents were friends from Shanghai. The party would be in full swing. The kids were having a noisy, great time. Then we would hear the steps coming down to the hall squeak. Those of you who have been at St. Tikhon's and have gone up and down those stairs know how badly they creak and squeak. They squeaked 60 years ago, and they squeak still today. Rock and roll music was in full swing, and as loud as the phonograph would allow. All of a sudden, someone would say, "Vladimir's coming." Immediately, someone would switch the records, and the sound of waltzes would fill the room. Vladimir was not tall in stature. He would walk around in between the couples. He would look up at them. And they were dancing, needless to say, a good distance apart. Looked directly into the faces of those dancing with a huge grin on his face. He would walk up to a few of his altar boys who were dancing, grab some of them by the hair, including myself. What he would do is he'd grab a lock of your hair, he'd twist his finger around it and shake your head. And then he'd do this. He knew exactly what was going on. Another time he came down at another dance during slow dance where everybody was, as customary in those days, very close, hanging on each other, slow dancing. As soon as Vladimir walked in, absolutely everyone separated themselves to a good distance between themselves, and again, Vladimir would walk among the couples, look at everyone, smile, and walk back upstairs. My mother, who is now 95 years old, reminisced frequently how Vladimir used to have similar dance parties in Shanghai. In the girls' school, they closed off the iconostas in their little house church. They removed the icons from the walls, and they danced in that room. They had no place else to gather. The dance was over. The church was refurbished the way it was before. Vladimir strongly believed that Orthodox youth should socialize together and more frequently, which in turn would produce Orthodox marriages and Orthodox families. Despite the fact that Vladimir was very strict at times, the youth was not afraid of him. It was a special vibe that came from him. It was a vibe of fatherly love, patience, and understanding. Saturday night distractions. While the cathedral was being built in San Francisco, the Church of All Russian Saints was being built in Burlingame. My father was the parish council president at the time. The parish was constantly holding events and fundraisers to benefit the construction of the church. Well, the parish council and sisterhood planned a grand gala ball in order to raise funds for the construction of the church. The ball was scheduled for a Saturday night. My grandmother on my father's side received a phone call from Vladimir. Where's Vadim? She was looking for my father all day long. My grandmother called my mom and said, tell Vadim to call Vladimir immediately. My father worked in the city, so immediately after work, he headed over to St. Tikhon's, where Vladimir resided. My father explained that he had a parish council meeting that night. To make a long story short, Vladimir told my father, whom he knew very well, that he would not bless having the ball on a Saturday night, and further clarified that if the ball is held, not one penny will go toward the building of the church. Of course, my father didn't argue and went straight to Burlingame to meet with the parish council, where he conveyed Vladimir's concerns. The parish council was extremely upset and demanded to go all together to Vladimir and complain. My father advised against him and recommended obedience. You don't want to try that. The parish council insisted on personally speaking with Vladimir, and well, that happened. After meeting with Vladimir, the parish council realized that he was right and humbled themselves like lambs with their tails tucked between their legs, and decided to obey. The word was put out that the ball was scheduled to Washington's birthday on a Sunday night. Monday then was holiday. My parents went to the hall on Saturday night that the ball was originally scheduled for and waited for people who didn't get the word to show up. It was raining heavily, the wind was ferocious, and not one person showed up. Subsequently, the ball was held on George Washington's birthday and was a tremendous success. Additional tickets were even sold. Vladimir called my father the next day and said, well, how did it go? There was another incident when an organization organized a huge ball in the Russian Center on a Saturday night on the eve of the canonization of St. John of Kronstadt. After the vigil, Vladimir was driven to the Russian Center, where he walked in. There was dead silence. Several people even climbed under the table so as not to be seen. Vladimir walked around, didn't say a word, and walked out. When the Russian scouts in San Francisco administration came to Vladimir in order to receive his blessing for the organization of a second scouts troop in San Francisco, he wrote a decree letter bestowing his blessing with the condition that the organization would not have any distracting events Saturday nights or on the eve of church feast days. It used to hang in the foyer of the Scouts' house across the street. Vladimir was very strict about this, so strict that he issued a decree after the incident in Russian Center. The holy canons dictate that Christians should spend the eves of feast days in prayer and with reverence in preparation for participation or attendance at the divine liturgy. If all Orthodox Christians are called to this, then this pertains to all the more to those who take an active part in the church service itself. Their participation in diversions on the eve of feast days is especially sinful. In view of the above, those who attend a dance or a similar form of entertainment and diversion may not participate in the choir the next day, may not serve in the altar, or enter the altar, or stand on clearus. As I mentioned before, twice a year I would spend a night at St. Tikhon's, once on Vladimir John's name's day and once on mine. During the construction of our cathedral, while services were being held in the old cathedral, there were court cases against the parish council. Unfortunately, the bishops in the synod were also split on various issues regarding our situation here in San Francisco. Vladimir John was under a lot of stress. This occurred on his name's day, June 23rd. There was a major court hearing in the days after Vladica's name's day, and bishops flew in to support Vladika. 2 other bishops flew in to oppose him. Vladika was at the hearing. The opposing bishops had no idea that it was Vladimir John's name's day and were compelled to serve with him during liturgy on his name's day. Needless to say, it was a tense situation. I was a kid and I felt it. There was a multitude of altar boys. After the liturgy, there was a huge banquet held in the cathedral hall in honor of Vladika's name's day. In those days, the altar boys were the last to leave the altar because they had to make sure that everything was clean, all the vestments were folded or hung up. By that time, the hall was overflowing with people. One of the senior subdeacons went in to check if there was room for the altar boys. Obviously, there wasn't. So we were lined up according to height, and single file went to Vladika, who was already seated, in order for him to bless and release us to go home. I remember there were about 30 of us. Vladika jumped up and told us to sit down and eat. When he was told there was no room, he looked around, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the keys to his quarters upstairs. He said, "There are tables and chairs up there. Set them up, I'll be up in a few minutes." Get this. Vladika then proceeded to take the plates off the clergy table. We all know that clergy gets better food than we do, right? He took each plate and handed it to the subdeacon, and it would pass down the line, and the last one would carry it upstairs. He cleared the table of food, called the head sister, and said, "Please bring food for the clergy." And Vladika went upstairs, and he spent lunch with us. Well, word got out to the parishes, and from then on, there was always a table for the altar boys. Repentance. 30 years had passed, and these are in no real order. 30 years had passed. I happened to be in New York visiting one of our retired priests in the nursing home at Novodevichy Convent. I happened to see Archbishop Serafim of Venezuela, who also resided in that nursing home. He remembered me from San Francisco because in my earlier youth, I was dating one of his parishioners that was from Venezuela. He asked me to come to his room. When I came to his room, he invited me to sit down and asked me with enthusiasm, how did the glorification services go? I spent some time explaining to him in substantial detail how things went and that there were thousands of people present participating in this glorious event. I happened to have a photograph of the icon which I painted, which is now over the relics of St. John, and he asked to see it. When I handed it to him, he reverently crossed himself, kissed it, and pressed it to his chest, asking me if he could keep the photograph. When I said, of course, he asked me to place it into his icon corner. I'm telling you this because Vladika Serafim was one of the two opposing bishops that were at this liturgy on his name's day. He came to oppose Vladika Jan, and he repented. He realized that he was wrong. So that really left a strong impression on me. Okay. Nighttime confession. My parents allowed me to spend the night at Vladika's twice a year. We've done that. Once on the eve of my name's day, I asked Vladika to hear my confession because I wanted to partake in Holy Communion during liturgy the next day. In all the schools of the diocese, Vladika taught and stressed that one's name's day is more important than its birthday. I spent the entire day with Vladika, helping him when he needed my assistance. By the way, there's a myth about Vladika Jan that he walked barefooted in the streets. He never did. He never walked barefoot. In the house, he did. At home, he walked around barefoot. But in the streets, he had sandals on a bare foot, but he had sandals on. So that's a myth, okay? During one of my visits, and I don't remember if this was the particular one, the Starosta Maria Alexandrovna walked up to me with a cube of butter and told me that Vladika wanted me to rub this butter on the floor of the altar. I had no idea why Vladika wanted me to do this, but I proceeded to do so. I was on all fours when I heard footsteps and saw two bare feet standing before me. I looked up, saw Vladika looking down at me with a big smile on his face. He told me that was enough and told me to get up and go wash my hands. To this day, the only reason I can think of is that Vladika was testing my obedience. I mean, Andrei, go rub some butter on the floor. I'm going nuts. Anyway, it was getting late, and Vladika was talking with me, telling me all kinds of things and dozing off all the time. I was already in my pajamas and was getting very sleepy. Every time Vladika would doze off, I would try and leave the room. He would wake up and continue speaking with me. Finally, I asked him, Vladika, will you hear my confession now, please? He jumped up and proceeded to go into the church. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. At that time, the Kursk icon of the Mother of God was visiting our diocese, and she was on an analogian in the middle of the church in her leather case. Vladika told me to stand in front of the icon, in my pajamas, and disappeared into the altar for quite a long time. All of a sudden, I see him come out of the northern deacon's door. To my surprise, he was vested in his mantia, his stole, amophorion, cuffs, and a mitre. In his hands, he had 5 or 6 boxes, reliquaries with holy saints, relics of holy saints. He placed them in the open lid of the icon's leather case, and said, "Before you is the Mother of God and saints. Repent. Kaisa." What followed was a loving fatherly discussion with me. Lots of questions, lots of answers. He asked me about my grades in school and told me how to improve them. One of those advices were drop your girlfriend. I was 12 years old, 13 years old. This discussion, which has remained in my heart ever since, will never be forgotten. After the confession, which lasted about 45 minutes, I went into the dining room, collapsed on the couch, and fell asleep like a baby. The next day, we were driven to the cathedral. I served in the altar and had Holy Communion. I remember being elated the whole day. San Francisco Airport. How are we time-wise?
There's time.
Okay. Can we go through a few more slides, Vladika? Yep. That's Vladika with some cadet students. Vladika at the court hearing. To the left is Vladika Sava of Edmonton, Vladika Jan, that's Vladika Leonti of Chile, and Vladika Niktari, Father Nicholas Dombrovsky, and on the far right was Vladika's personal secretary, Father Leonid Upshinsky. Look at the expressions on their faces during this scandal. It was awful, okay? By the way, that was the staff that fell on my head.
That one?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Many may not know why the court case, why the two bishops opposed. You're saying this, we know it's all this, but maybe some don't. Why?
Well, I mentioned it early that when a church is being built, the devil works 24/7. And there were two factions here. People were accusing other people of misappropriation of funds, blah, 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 taking each other to court. There were two newspapers at the time, Russian Life, Ruskaya Жизнь, and there was a Soviet paper here, Novaya Zarya.
The Examiner also wrote an article on the second page.
Yes, they did. But this Novaya Zarya paper was very anti-Vladika Jan and anti-building of the cathedral. So there were feuds in the media, right? The media mob, as it's called now, right? That lasted for several years. Unfortunately, our synod was also divided in these issues, and that caused a lot of stress as well. Okay.
Slides.
Oh, yes, we're doing slides. Okay, go on. 3 diocesan bishops, Vladika Jan, Vladika Tikhon, and future Vladika Antoni. He was bishop in Australia then. In the front, you'll see Archbishop Peter. In the back, right to the left of Vladika Tikhon is our starosta, Nick Buick. That's Teta Marusia Hrapova, Елена Nikolaevna Lukyanova, Olga Skaryatnikova, and Vladika Pyotr's father, Pavel Andreevich. Next. That's Father Elias Vien, who chrismated me and baptized my brother. Senior priest here in our cathedral. He graduated from seminary in the Chinese ecclesiastical mission.
He lived in 3 different centuries too.
Yeah, he was born in 1896. I asked him, I called him Yeya, which means grandpapa, dedushka in Chinese. Yeya, what year were you born? And he says, the year that the martyr Tsar Nikolai Alexandrovich II, came to the throne. I was born, 1896. He lived over 3 centuries. And when I asked him when we were at his 110th birthday celebration, I said, сколько тебе лет? How old are you? He shrugged his shoulders. I said, 110, 110. He said, oh. And then he went like this. He went, para. It's time. Okay. Metropolitan Anastasi was old, extremely frail, and was unable to fulfill his duties as first hierarch of our church. He announced his retirement and charged the Synod of Bishops to elect a new metropolitan. This all took place in the 60s, roughly at the same time that things in San Francisco were beginning to calm down. Bishop Filaret of Melbourne was also in San Francisco on his way to the Synod of Bishops. Vladika John's flock and supporters were all almost positive that Vladika John would return to San Francisco with a white klobuk, in other words, the metropolitan's hat. In those days, it was customary for people to go to the airport to either greet or escort the bishops to and from the airport. In this particular case, since this was in the early aftermath of our San Francisco problems, and the upcoming event in New York was huge and of great historic significance, a large group of diocesan faithful gathered at the airport. Bishop Niktari, the local clergy, the cathedral choir, Abbess Ariadna, her sisters, and the miraculous icon of the Vladimir, Mother of God. The processional cross, people with icons, were all assembled ready to greet the bishops at the gate. I mean, this was a spectacle. If you can imagine, probably 100 people with icons across the choir singing at the gate. It was a sight to behold. Meanwhile, in New York, the division between the bishops in regards to Vladimir John was still quite prevalent. Vladimir John, in order to avoid a schism, remembering the scripture, recommended that the bishops look toward the youngest in order to take the reins of the new first hierarch of the church. So, as God's providence had it, the youngest bishop of 6 months, he was only 6 months old as a bishop, Bishop Filaret, was elected to be the third metropolitan of our church. So it was Metropolitan Filaret in the White Klobuk. Vladika John, Vladika Niktari returned to San Francisco after the Sabor. They were greeted the same way as when they left. Abbess Ariadne with the Mother of God icon and nuns, the clergy, cathedral choir, all escorted the bishops up the jetway in a procession. Can you imagine? Try and do that today. In a procession up the jetway to the curb where the bishops got in the car and left. So that's the way it was way back when, right? After a long uphill battle, laden with trials and tribulations, court cases, scandals, slander, etc., St. John completed the construction of the new cathedral. The long-awaited day of raising of the crosses and plans for a grandiose procession of the cross were about to become a reality. Metropolitan Filaret, well, this chapter is called Disagreement Between Bishops. Metropolitan Filaret was to officiate along with Archbishop John. Bishop Sava of Edmonton, who was a staunch supporter of Vladikayan and a lawyer by profession, and Bishop Niktari of Seattle, the vicar bishop of this diocese. The procession was to go from St. Tikhon's Church on 15th and Balboa, where Vladika resided, down 15th Avenue, left on Anza Street, all the way to 26th Avenue, and turning right to the cathedral. Anza was closed off. Needless to say, there was a police escort. The weather was awful. It was raining, as they say, cats and dogs. It was windy. A very large crowd of more than 1,000 people, according to the assessments. Standing all the way down 15th Avenue, there was a sea of umbrellas. Metropolitan Filaret was to head up the procession. He was fully vested, as were all the other bishops. All of a sudden, the Metropolitan went into Vladika's room and told him that he's not going to go on the procession in this weather. He's going to drive in a car. Vladika John was visibly upset. I was the only altar boy in the room at the time, vested in my sticharion. I could see that the tonality of voices between the bishops began to heat up. I felt very uncomfortable and started to back out of the room, feeling that it was improper for me to be present during such a discussion. Vladika, without turning his head, grabbed my sleeve and said, "Stoy." In other words, don't move. I lowered my head and stood silently. After the conversation, Vladika got up, walked out of his room with me at his side. He said to his subdeacon, "We begin the procession," and began to exit St. Tikhon's. Outside, the cross, the lantern, the cathedral choir, banners, icons were all in formation. The clergy was lined up in 2 straight lines. All of a sudden, as Vladika exited the church with the other bishops, believe it or not, the rain stopped. Clouds opened up, the sun shined brightly, and this huge procession moved forward on dry land. Or as they say, or as we sing in church, Pasuchu Pishashesova. Vladika had a small silver cross in his hand, which had many relics of saints in it. For the entire procession, Vladika was walking with a cross like this. I marveled at the fact, how could he keep his hand up for such a long time for such a distance. I mean, you try and keep your hand up like that. His arm was strong. During the procession, the clergy and the choir, along with a multitude of parishioners, chanted various prayers. When we turned right on 26th Avenue, it was the first time I personally had seen the cathedral completed. I was in awe. Then came the blessing of the huge 5 crosses to be lifted up top of the cathedral. The heavens over the cathedral opened. The sun was reflecting off the crosses as they dangled from the crane while being lifted. After the main cross was lifted up and placed on the main dome, a white dove flew around the cupola and rested upon the main cross. The multitude of people below gasped with joy. I'm going to read you an excerpt of Bishop Sava's chronicles about the funeral of Vladimir. How are we doing time-wise? We're okay?
5 minutes.
The funeral of Archbishop John of Western America in San Francisco, who suddenly reposed on the 19th of June, Old Style, the 2nd of June, New Style, in Seattle after serving Divine Liturgy in Moleben before the miraculous Kursk icon of the Mother of God, took place on Thursday, the 24th of June, Old Style, 7th of July, New Style, in the Cathedral of the Mother of God, Joy of All Sorrow in San Francisco. The funeral began at 6 o'clock in the evening and it concluded after multitudes of people bade farewell to the reposed hierarch at 1 o'clock in the morning. Metropolitan Filaret officiated, concelebrating with Archbishop Leonti of Chile, Averki of Syracuse, Bishop Sava of Edmonton, and Niktari of Seattle. 24 priests and several deacons. The choir sang under the direction of Mikhail Sergeyevich Konstantinov. No one of the participants will ever forget the striking, compunctual, uplifting, prayerful funeral. Despite the deep sorrow of countless followers of Archbishop John, there was an engulfing feeling of joy. For 6 days, Vladimir laid in an open coffin. Despite the hot summer weather, there was absolutely no sign of decomposition, and his hand was soft and pliable. Also, to be taken into consideration that the funeral directors did absolutely nothing to Vladimir's remains. The words of St. Ignacy Brichaninov in his writings, Ponderance on Death. Has anyone seen the body of the righteous, from which the soul has departed? There is no foul scent, there is no fear in approaching it, and at the burial, grief is dissolved by unexplainable joy. According to these words, to the words of this saint, it is a definite indication that the reposed has attained the mercy and the grace of God. It was unusually touching how the youth expressed their tender love for the reposed hierarch, who was truly their leader and mentor. During this time that the coffin was in the cathedral, many of the youth spent nights there reading the Psalter and singing prayers, not leaving to go home. The girls slept on the choir loft in their sleeping bags, and we altar boys slept on the floor on the right where his relics are right now. We all slept on the floor. The coffin was closed at night, and Vladika Niktari would come to the cathedral in the middle of the night and wake everybody up, and he would open the coffin and he would open the face of Vladimir. And then we had to do 50 prostrations after that. But several times we saw the face of Vladimir during those times. And orphans from his orphanage also came and they sang psalms and prayers at the coffin throughout the night. So there was a vigil for almost 5 days at the coffin. Before commencement of the funeral, Metropolitan gave a sermon during which he quoted the words of Metropolitan Antony Khrapovitsky, his portrait is in the middle there, the founder of our church, from a letter that he sent to the Far East when the newly consecrated bishop was being sent. I send you a piece of my heart, a miracle of our time, a young podvizhnik, I don't know how to translate the word. Ascetic. Young ascetic, Bishop John. As I mentioned before, the remains of Vladika John were brought from Seattle to San Francisco. He was not embalmed. The entire time Vladika reposed in an open coffin. Every day, a representative from Daphne Funeral Home, which was an Orthodox funeral home, would come to check the temperature of Vladika's body. It remained constant. Despite the hot weather, the funeral personnel could not find any signs of decomposition or odors. There is an official letter from the funeral parlor. Daphne Funeral Services, San Francisco, July 29, 1966. Cathedral of the Holy Virgin. Attention, Mr. Alexei Katel. Dada Alyosha Katel, right? Dear Sir, the remains of His Eminence, Archbishop John Maximovich, were brought to San Francisco from the city of Seattle, Washington State, on the 3rd of July, unembalmed. Upon arrival, the body was brought to our chapel on 1 Church Street for inspection, and we found his remains to be in excellent condition. After this, the body of the Archbishop was transported to the cathedral, where it lay in state with an open coffin for 5 days. The condition of the body was checked by us daily. Allow me to express my personal opinion. I felt that the hand of God preserved our Archbishop. His condition was excellent, even after 5 days of services at the coffin. This is for your information. With respect, Nicholas W. Paulos, Vice President. Let's go through some more slides. We're in the slides right now. Vladika at the construction of our cathedral. Next. This was the huge procession to the blessing of the crosses down Anza Street. That's Father Leonid Dubshinsky in the front. Okay? That's the blessing of the 5 crosses. The 4 bishops who participated, Vladika Sava on the left, Metropolitan Filaret, Vladika Yan, and Vladika Niktari. Next. That's the raising of the main cross. Next. You look at the heaven, it's blue sky. Right? Next. Vladika and his altar boys, George Kalaso in the front, one of the Bagatskys, Pavel Lukyanov, now Archbishop Peter, Vovka Lebedev, God rest his soul, Serozha Bagatsky. There's Kalasos in the front there, Vitya and Sasha. This is all in front of the old cathedral, okay? Vladika Yan in the office in St. Tikhon's during one of his visits. This is at the convent of Our Lady of Vladimir. That's Pavel Andreevich Urtiev, one of our subdeacons, choir member who just reposed. Father Nicholas Patoyev. You should have heard the way he served. Unbelievable. Vladika Yan, Father Serafim, who passed away at an early age, and our Starasta Nikita Buick on the left. Next. Vladika in his office, in his room, in his cell. This is at the Russian River, the old Russian River outdoor church. Notice the mitre that Vladika is wearing. It was basically a velvet little cap with icons on it. Okay, next. This is in Los Angeles, the Protection Mother of God Church. I think it was during the consecration of that church. Go on. This is at a trapeza. Father Nicholas Ponomaryov, rector of the Palo Alto Church, Bishop Sava, Metropolitan, Vladika Yan and Vladika Niktari, and on the far right, Father Boris Kritsky, the keeper of the Kursk Mother of God icon. Vladika Yan at his typewriter. Again, Vladika Yan with his altar boys. That's Bishop Peter in the front. Okay. Vladika Yan at Fort Ross, serving liturgy. I think this is the only photograph that we could find. Okay. Vladika Yan with Vladika Antonia in 1956. Go on. Vladika Yan greeting the King of Serbia, King Peter of Serbia. That's Father Gilasi, cell attendant of Metropolitan Anastasia in the back. The subdeacon's name was Igor. I don't remember his last name. Go on. This was a synod of bishops at the time. And I believe that there isn't a single one of them alive with us today. Okay, go on. This is Vladimir at the old cathedral, surrounded by kids, which was very typical. He had no problem with kids sitting on his cathedra during the services. Kids would sit down on his cathedra. Somebody would try to move them away, and he'd say, "Don't touch them." Go on. Again, Vladimir at St. Tikhon's. Vladimir with his altar boys in the new cathedral with the old plywood iconostas. Vladimir on Pascha. And that's Vladimir's hands in the coffin. That's Vladimir in the coffin. It's the funeral procession around the church. I was under the coffin as they were carrying it. See the archbishops? That's one of my favorite photographs of Liturgical. Thank you for your attention.